Колеги, продовжуємо наш робочий день.
Dear colleagues, we are continuing our working day and we'll talk about decentralization, or rather about the list of promised decentralization reforms that the signatories to the coalition agreement have forgotten. And the floor goes to Sikora, Director of Open Society Foundation, and Lesya Shevchenko, Senior Expert at Reanimation Package of Reforms in Kyiv. Good afternoon. The aim of our today's press conference is to give an intermediate assessment of the 100 days of the Parliament and the coalition agreement work. First of all, we'd like to tell you that about the political promises that were given in the fiscal sphere and how they are being fulfilled, about the forgotten promises or partially fulfilled promises, and about the opportunities that citizens have to influence the realization of the opportunity in locations. Decentralization, as you know, along with the fight against corruption, was the most popular promise of political forces during the parliamentary elections of last year, and these promises were people pinned high hopes on these promises as far as fiscal decentralization is concerned, and the proposals for amendments in tax code were suggested and tabled by the Yatsenyuk government, and at last they were adopted on the eve of the adoption of the budget for 2015, right before. Our experience of analyzing pre-election programs, which lasts for 10 years, tells us about the problems that are there with the political forces. This is the lack of specification and measurability of political promises, then the level of fulfillment of those promises in the parliament, and in fact the early parliamentary elections gave us the movement of the center of decision-making. We now have parliamentary presidential country, and for the first time our parliament has a majority of 302 votes, and they can even overcome the presidential veto. How can we assess the work of the parliamentarians in the sphere of fiscal decentralization? I have to tell you that the promises of political forces that came to the parliament were hardly measurable, and they were not specific, and there is a need to specify those promises, which was done in the text of the coalition agreement that became in fact the major document for the Yatsenyuk government that has to be implemented in the parliament of this convocation. And in fact, the coalition agreement for parliamentary forces is the marriage contract that they have to stick to. But we see that they are not prepared to stick to every clause of this contract. First of all, I mean political promises of Petro Poroshenko bloc, Popular Front, Self-Help, Samopomich, Radical Party, and the Batkivshina Party. I can single out two messages here. In spite of the signing of the coalition agreement, there are contradictions in the sphere of fiscal decentralization, and this is most notable in the position of Batkivshina Party. They are supported by Association of Small Towns and Association of Village and Settlement Councils, and as is known, the representatives of villages and small towns are going to lose most of all as a result of fiscal decentralization. And in fact, they're being stimulated for such association by limiting the transfers from the state budget to their budgets and some other mechanisms. They are facing a dilemma now. They should either merge or die out. The government law recently signed by the president about voluntary merger of local communities is also playing a role in this. Ivan Sikora will dwell on local taxes, but in view of the fact that the president has signed the government's law, we have not seen that any information campaign, because if there are some non-agreed positions and if Batkivshina is in a position to coalition agreements, then, we haven't seen any information campaign, no explanation, no instruction, and we understand that merger of territorial communities is a stillborn child, because if they do not understand what this is going to give them, what positive things it will bring, then fiscal decentralization will put an end to decentralization as such. We only have 7 months before the October elections to local councils, and there's no sense talking about decentralization if the reform does not take place before the elections. Another message, which is of course positive, I want to tell you about the promises in the coalition agreement that are being fulfilled, the principle of leveling the local budgets as far as revenue, not expenditure, is concerned. And this will, of course, stimulate the participation of communities in the budget process. The Open Society Foundation and the Reanimation Package of Reforms are actively involved in this process, and we do have such an opportunity, but this does not mean that everything is going to be all right, because as you know, the budget discussion that we initiated in Kyiv, and this happened for the first time here, we have not seen any real opportunities to influence the contents of the budget. Again, Ivan Sikora will dwell on these points. We have an experience of holding public hearings with the authorities, and we also are into budgets for 4 years, and we are going on a regional tour in the east of Ukraine, Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkiv, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, Odessa, where we want to talk more with local communities and activists about the opportunities that they get today with the new legislation, and how they can influence the local budget at a local level, and what the communities and activists should do so that there is an understanding of fiscal decentralization, and that the amalgamation and merger of local communities goes more actively. Ivan Sikora now.
So continuing what Lesya Shevchenko was talking about, I would like to add one more thing. The biggest source for local budgets is the personal income tax, and the norms which should, the distribution according to the norms is what is the main subject for arguments between different political forces. One promise which was in the text of coalition agreement wasn't fulfilled, and that is to ensure the payment of the personal income tax so that this tax is paid not where the subject of business activity is registered, but at the place where salary is paid, where the business activity is conducted. These are, as a rule, not big cities, because we understand that all the biggest payers of personal income tax, they are mostly registered either in Kyiv or in some big cities. And we have not seen yet that political forces have executed on this promise, which is in the coalition agreement. And we can state that the movement to stimulating economic activity is quite locally is quite slow, because the focus of fighting between political forces is in what should be the rate of the personal income tax at local level. The legislative initiative that we have mentioned, the legislative initiative of Batkivshina, is about going back to leaving for the villages and settlements part of the personal income tax. And that this wording is clear, but there's no readiness to implement it. The second one was the promise on servicing or the payment orders, and that was mostly related to the state treasury. The payments were always delayed, and they were very often transferred manually. And in fact, in the result, on the one hand, the lobbyists were working at the level of central authorities who were influencing the transfer of this or that payment. On the other hand, the mayors were dependent on local authorities, on local state authorities, and they had to request to get the money. Now, and there were certain promises given, and that issue had to be resolved, but now we can state that there is only partial implementation of that promise, because this possibility to transfer money like that now concerns only budgetary institutions, and the term of the transfer will be tied up to execution of the budget. But in conditions of the economic crisis, that creates the possibility quite freely interpret and regulate the transfer of the payments which had to go to local level. The next important thing is local budget, local taxes. The local taxes are to be managed according to European standards, and that was the promise of all political forces who signed coalition agreement. Now the real estate tax, transportation tax, and payment for land. And the income from that, revenues from these taxes are regulated at a local level. Now we can see that, unfortunately, what we expected about the budget which were forecasted, we don't see them. Why this is happening is that we believe is related to, unfortunately, abuse with land, with real estate, which is at the level of the local communities. And we believe that the volume of or scope of this abuse is many billion hryvnias. The price of corruption at local level related to management of land and real estate is billions of hryvnias at the level of Kyiv, at the city of Kyiv. We have assessed it, now we are assessing some other regional centers, and the forecasts of the government, which were submitted together with the draft law on amendments to the budget code, which was saying that the revenues to the local budgets in the future will grow 2 or 3 times. Well, now, what did they mean talking about the future? But we do not see any trends like that now. The money from local taxes will come only when the sectoral policy is changed. That is in the sphere of bridge construction, land relations. On the other hand, when there are certain rules of game in the market, when the land is not distributed like now to those who manage to lobby that, and then local citizens try to find out who was right, themselves or developers, but when there are very clear plans of the territories and designs, then this resource could bring billions. We believe if we are talking about increase of revenues from local taxes, that is first of all related to fighting corruption, to clear sectoral reforms, and also it is important the participation of the community in budgetary decisions approval. And we want to include into the budget code all these provisions. But as we can see it from our experience in Kyiv, for example, to participate and to influence the decisions on 2 different things. It's important to understand the budgetary process and only then we can change the situation. The reform in the sphere of the local budgets are to be taken out of the shadow, and the administering of the physical income tax means the development of very transparent documents for developers, and also it is important for citizens to participate in the budgetary process and control the executive authorities and the councils, local councils. Thank you. If you have any questions to Ivan, Lesya has some meeting and she left, so if you have questions to Ivan, you're welcome.
Oleg Shvets, the Council of Maidan Activists. Do you take into account that the processes of decentralization are about the decentralization of the disorder that there is in the center, and it actually is supposed by the code and the law, and the decentralization of the disorder won't change the system? Even the department that you are talking about is not stipulated by the law. It just means that the property of the Ukrainian people will be confiscated and sold out. And we shall provide at the level of the code and the laws that the local authorities should manage the property in the interests of the Ukrainian people and territorial communities, that there's a special account for territorial communities and the Ukrainian people, and they get the profit. And this is the national income that is being then distributed to many accounts of citizens and territorial communities, and this is not there. There's a procedure of liquidation of the people of Ukraine. There's a methodical sale of the property, and they are just alienating it in favor of other subjects who are getting richer. So where is your question? Do you take this into account, and how do you plan to fight this? Because I have the impression that you want to liquidate the after effects, but how do you fight the reason? The reason for corruption at the local level is the lack of clear-cut and transparent rules of the game. On the other hand, the opportunities for influence of local community at local councillors and the use of local resources, property and budget. So these are the major problems, and they can be solved only when the rules of the game are changed, when we have clear-cut rules for distribution of land resource, of property. You know, there's a law on regulating the city building documentation, and there's a Article 24 which is being suspended all the time, and they are distributing land not according to this article, and that's why there's corruption. About the control over deputies who are collectively responsible for adopting decisions, this is a subject for regulation by the law on elections that is going to be adopted. If the local elections go according to another law that will make deputies, councillors dependent on voters, not on the business that finances the campaign, then we can expect that they will adopt decisions in the interests of the community, not of those who paid for their election. Again, the participation of people in making decisions. If you as a citizen want to promote the point of view that here the money for the community is being lost, and you do not have tools to influence the officials, how to influence them, if you do not understand how you effectively influence the councillors for whom you voted, then the opportunity remains just the opportunity, and it is not transformed into real influence on those to whom we delegated decision making. Our initiative is going to return billions of hryvnias to local budgets. We want to create a civil movement whose activists will be able to efficiently influence local authority and provide for real decentralization. If we do not have those three components, then the reforms will remain just good intentions and won't have any significant effect on the life of communities. And there's going to be a huge disappointment in what the parties suggested during the elections. Thank you, Mr. Sikora, for the information. Our next briefing is within 10 minutes.